What if the child the world knows as Lilibet was never where the story said she was? Not in the way people believe. Not with the woman everyone assumes is her mother. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let that sit for a second. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with palace walls or glossy magazine covers. It begins with a voice that was never meant to be heard. A voice that stayed silent for years, watching from the shadows while another narrative took over the world. And now, according to explosive claims, that silence has shattered. Imagine this. You turn on the news. You scroll your phone. And suddenly, a woman steps forward claiming she is the real biological mother of Lilibet. Not a rumor. Not a whisper. A direct claim. And she's not asking for money. She's not asking for attention. She's demanding custody. Ask yourself this. Why now? Why would someone wait this long, endure this much silence, only to come forward at the most volatile moment imaginable? What changed? What broke? And why are insiders allegedly saying that panic set in the moment her name was spoken out loud? Here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Because according to these claims, this isn't just about a child. It's about an arrangement the public was never supposed to question. An understanding that allegedly relied on silence, on distance, on everyone playing their role perfectly, until one person decided she couldn't do it anymore. And here's the contradiction that stops people cold. If none of this is true, why is there suddenly so much urgency behind closed doors? Why are conversations allegedly happening at odd hours? Why are sources whispering about documents, timelines, and decisions that don't quite line up the way we've been told? This matters now because stories don't explode without pressure. Truths don't surface without a trigger. And people don't risk everything unless the alternative feels worse. Think about it. Would you stay silent if it meant watching your own child grow up under someone else's name? Would you keep your distance while the world applauded a version of motherhood you claim never existed? Or would there come a moment when silence feels like betrayal? According to this woman, that moment came suddenly. And when it did, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was quiet. A realization. A decision made in the middle of the night. The kind of decision that changes lives forever. What makes this even more unsettling is what she allegedly says next. That there were rules, boundaries, promises. That as long as everyone stayed in their lane, the story would hold. But when one of those rules was broken, everything began to unravel. And if that's true, then the question becomes even more disturbing. Who broke it? Because once that line was crossed, there was no going back. What had been private became fragile. What had been controlled became unpredictable, and what had been hidden began pushing its way into the light. In just a moment, we're going to step back to the very beginning, to who this woman says she is, how she claims she became part of this story, and the single decision she says set off a chain reaction no one could stop. But before we do, ask yourself one thing. If a child's identity was built on silence, what happens when the silence finally speaks? Because according to what comes next, the first phone call didn't bring answers. It brought fear. And that was only the beginning. So who was on the other end of that first phone call? And why, according to multiple claims, did the room go quiet the moment her voice was recognized? Here's the thing that immediately unsettles people about this woman. She didn't appear out of nowhere. She wasn't chasing headlines. She wasn't sliding into tabloids with blurry photos or anonymous emails. According to the story she tells, she had already lived with this truth longer than anyone realizes. Years longer. Long enough for silence to become routine. Long enough for watching from a distance to feel almost normal. Almost. She describes herself not as a disruptor, but as someone who was told, very clearly, to stay out of the picture. That this was how things had to be. That it was for the best. For the child. For everyone involved. And for a long time, she claimed she believed that. Or maybe she forced herself to. Because silence can feel easier when you convince yourself it's temporary. She says there were conditions. Boundaries drawn early. She would not speak publicly. She would not interfere. She would not contradict the story being presented to the world. In return, she believed her child would be protected, safe, loved, provided for. But here's where the contradiction creeps in. If everything was fine, why did communication slowly disappear? Why did updates allegedly become vague, then rare, then stop entirely? Why did questions begin to feel unwelcome? She describes moments that felt small at the time, but heavy in hindsight. Missed calls, messages unanswered, requests that were once acceptable suddenly treated as threats, and that sinking feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Let me ask you something. If you were told to trust a system, but that system stopped speaking to you, how long would you keep believing? According to her, the breaking point wasn't dramatic. No screaming match. No public confrontation. It was a single realization that landed quietly but violently. That she no longer knew where her child truly was. That she was expected to keep believing without seeing, without asking, without reassurance. And that's when fear replaced patience. She says the decision to speak didn't come from anger. It came from panic. The kind that tightens your chest at night. The kind that makes you replay every conversation, every promise, every moment you chose silence over instinct. Here's the part that rattles people the most. She claims that when she finally reached out again, not to negotiate but to understand, the response wasn't reassurance. It was resistance, a sudden change in tone. As if the rules had changed and no one bothered to tell her. Why would someone react defensively if there was nothing to hide? That question is what she says pushed her past the point of no return. Because once doubt sets in, silence no longer feels protective. It feels complicit. And when she realized that staying quiet might cost her the truth forever, she made the call she'd avoided for years. Not to the press, not to a lawyer, but to someone she believed still had influence over the original arrangement. That call, she says, didn't calm things down. It escalated them. Because instead of clarity, she was allegedly met with a warning. Not explicit, not threatening, just enough to make one thing clear. She was stepping outside her role. And once that boundary was crossed, there was no pretending anymore. But what she didn't know then was that this single call would trigger a response far bigger than she imagined. A response that would expose how fragile the entire situation really was. Because when control starts slipping, people don't stay calm. And according to what happened next, control was already slipping fast. What if the story everyone accepted wasn't built on lies, but on permission? Because according to what this woman claims next, nothing about this situation was accidental. There was an understanding from the very beginning. A structure. A plan. One that relied on everyone knowing their place and never stepping outside of it. She says it began as something carefully framed as practical. Temporary. Controlled. The language mattered. Words like arrangement. Agreement. Boundaries. Words that sound clean on paper but feel heavy when you live inside them. At first, she claims, it was presented as a solution. A way to handle circumstances without chaos. She would carry the truth quietly. Others would carry the public narrative. And the child, at the center of it all, would never have to feel the tension underneath. That was the promise. But here's where the cracks start to show. She says the arrangement depended on one critical assumption. That the story would never need to change. That no one would ask too many questions. That time itself would smooth everything over. Except time doesn't erase instinct. She describes watching moments unfold from a distance. Carefully curated appearances. Words chosen with precision. And a version of motherhood presented so confidently that questioning it felt almost forbidden. And yet, behind the scenes, she claims the tone was very different. Requests for updates became negotiations. Simple questions were treated like oversteps. The same people who once emphasized cooperation now emphasize silence. Ask yourself this. If everything was as solid as it appeared, why was silence so important? She says there were moments when the contradiction became impossible to ignore. Public declarations of closeness paired with private distance. Celebrations she watched from afar. Milestones she learned about secondhand. And the irony? She claims the more convincing the public image became, the more restricted her access felt. It's like watching someone live in your house while being told not to open the door. She also alleges that the arrangement was never meant to be permanent. That there were discussions early on about future transitions. About honesty one day. About explanations that would come when the time was right. But that day, she says, never arrived. Instead, the rules tightened. And then came the moment that changed everything. She claims she noticed a shift in how decisions were being made. Not discussed. Decided. As if her role had quietly expired without her consent. When she raised concerns, she wasn't met with dialogue. She was met with reminders. Of what she had agreed to. Of how much was at stake. Of how damaging disruption could be. That's when the arrangement stopped feeling mutual. That's when it started feeling enforced. Let me ask you something. If an agreement only works as long as one side stays silent, is it really an agreement at all? According to her, the final straw wasn't a denial. It was a discovery, a realization that certain choices were being made without her knowledge, choices that directly affected the child she claims is hers. And once she understood that, the moral math changed completely. Because silence no longer protected the child, it protected the story. And that distinction is what pushed her to do the unthinkable. She didn't just want answers anymore. She wanted her child back. But when she made that intention clear, the response wasn't negotiation. It was alarm. And what happened after that demand is the reason this story didn't stay private. Because once custody entered the conversation, everything escalated. And the next reaction, she claims, was immediate. And far more aggressive than she ever expected. What happens when a private arrangement is confronted with a public demand? According to her, the moment she used the word custody, the temperature in the room dropped. Conversations that once felt slow and managed suddenly became sharp, efficient, urgent. It was as if a switch had been flipped. She says she didn't arrive at that word lightly. This wasn't a threat. It wasn't revenge. It was the final option left when every other door had quietly closed. When questions were deflected. When reassurances stopped. When trust, already fragile, finally collapsed under its own weight. Think about that for a second. Custody isn't a casual word. It's a line in the sand. It means you're no longer asking to be heard. You're demanding to be recognized. She claims she made it clear what she was not asking for. Not money. Not exposure. Not control over anyone else's life. She wanted something far simpler and far more explosive. Legal acknowledgement. Access. The right to make decisions for the child she says she brought into this world. And that's when, according to her, panic set in. She describes a sudden flurry of activity. Messages sent through intermediaries instead of directly. Delays framed as procedural necessities. And an immediate shift from emotional language to legal language. Why the rush? If there was nothing to fear, why did everything suddenly become urgent? She alleges that the response wasn't curiosity. It wasn't concern for the child. It was containment. A focus on limiting exposure. On controlling timelines. On keeping the conversation narrowly framed. And here's the part that unsettles even the most skeptical listeners. She says she was warned. Not overtly. Not with threats that could be quoted. But with implications. That pursuing custody would be messy. That it would hurt people. That it would create consequences no one could fully predict. Let me ask you something. Why would asking for a child trigger warnings instead of dialogue? According to her, that was the moment she realized this was no longer about cooperation. It was about power. About who had been allowed to define reality for so long that any challenge to it felt dangerous. She claims she had already prepared herself emotionally. What she hadn't prepared for was the speed of the pushback. The way doors that were once open slammed shut. The way silence returned, but this time louder than ever. And then there was the evidence. She doesn't describe it in detail. Not yet. But she insists it exists. Records. Communications. Timelines. Pieces that, when placed side by side, tell a story very different from the one the public knows. She says that once those materials were mentioned, the tone changed again. Colder. Shorter. More cautious. That's when she understood something crucial. That this wasn't just a personal dispute. This was a situation built on layers. Layers of image, influence, and carefully maintained perception. And once custody was on the table, those layers began to crack. Because custody doesn't argue about narratives. It argues about facts. She claims she was given one last opportunity to reconsider. To step back. To let things remain as they were. To trust that everything would be handled internally. She didn't. And that refusal, she says, is what set the next phase into motion. The phase that could no longer be controlled quietly. The phase that would pull this story out of private rooms and into public view. Because when silence stops working, truth doesn't whisper. It forces its way out. And according to what comes next, the first document wasn't leaked by accident. It was revealed on purpose. So what happens when a story built on silence runs out of places to hide? Because according to what followed, this was the moment everything changed. The moment the carefully managed narrative stopped being enough. When private pressure became public gravity. And when the people who believed they controlled the timeline realized the timeline no longer belonged to them. Remember the question we started with. What if the child the world knows as Lilibet was never where the story said she was? After every